Due to corona-related restrictions, many communities find themselves forced to omit some of the Piyutim liturgical poems from the Tefillah. Is this permissible?
The first thing to point out with regards to this question is the fundamental fact that Piyutim are not an essential part of the Tefillah. By that I mean that despite the fact that for many people the various Piyutim, that is to say liturgical poems, many of them very ancient, that are recited particularly by the Ashkenazim, but not only, as part of the Tefillah on various days of the year, and particularly on Rosh HaShannah and Yom Kippurim, these Piyutim were not universally accepted by all the Hachamim, by all the sages, as being permissible, or at the very least were not viewed as desirable. Some, it is true, were in favor of these Piyutim. Some of the Chachamim, in fact, authored various Piyutim. But there were other Chachamim who were most definitely opposed to this practice. It is well known that many of the Piyutim that we find in the Mahzorim of the Ashkenazim and the Jews from Italy and what's called Mahzor Romania and other ancient Sidurim include Piyutim, many of which are recited to this day by various ancient Paitanim, particularly Rabbi Elazar HaKhalir, who lived in Eretz Yisrael apparently during the 7th century, or the end of the 7th and into the 8th century perhaps. And his Piyutim, on the one hand, are very well known and recited to this day in many communities. On the other hand, they were vociferously critiqued by other Chachamim. Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra points out that not a few of the Khalil's Piyutim are in fact very cleverly constructed riddles. That is to say, it is frequently difficult and sometimes well-nigh impossible to know exactly what was intended by the words of the piyut, of the liturgical poem these poems were inserted into the text of the tefillot. On the one hand, one can assume that the Khalil knew exactly what he was saying and what he intended, and he clearly had knowledge and a command of the Hebrew language. On the other hand, some of the statements, some of the usages are very obscure and unclear even to the very scholarly and learned. How much more so to the average Jew who finds himself standing or sitting in shul, listening to these piyutim, and frankly being entirely bewildered. Even if this person generally understands the tefillah in Hebrew and has a fairly good understanding of Hebrew. And Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra points out that the tefillah that is recited in the Beit Knesset is to be comprehensible to all, not just to a select few, and as we are saying, occasionally even to those few, the meaning of the piyut is not always clear. In addition, there were many Hachamim, amongst them the Rambam, who were of the view that it is asur, it is not permissible to introduce such piyutim into the brachot before or after Kriyat Shema, or into the brachot of the tefillah of the Shemoneh Esrei, or the tefillah that is recited on Shabbat or Mu'adim, Hagim. That is asur to do so, against the halakha. And that is why, to this day, in all Sfaradi and Temani communities, such piyutim are not recited as part of those brachot of Kriyat Shema or the Tefillah. There are certain piyutim that they recite before the Tefillah or after the Tefillah, before Kriyat Torah or before the shofar is blown, or after, but not during the Tefillah itself. And here it is proper to quote from Rambam's responsum, a well-known letter that he wrote in response to certain questions that were addressed to him. In the Blau edition, this is in the second volume on page 490 and 491. Rambam here refers at the beginning of this Teshuvah to Tosafot, additions, and Mizmorim, that is to say, Prakim from Tehillim, that are recited before the Tefillah in order to assist a person in focusing his mind and preparing for the Tefillah. And Rambam praises such a practice, but he goes on to say, Aval zeh rasui leyahid or leyahidim. This is a very proper and correct practice for the individual, or for a group of individuals who choose together to do such a thing. Sheyuchlu la'asot zot bevatehem. They can do this at home. They can gather if they want. A group of people can get together, perhaps very early in the morning, learn something, recite some mizmorim together, or whatever it is in order to prepare for the tefillah. Certainly the individual can do so. Aval bevatei kenesiot hu leda'ati to'uth. But to do so in a synagogue, which is a public place, as he writes, Mishum shebatei knesiot hem l'rabim. A Beth Knesset is for the general public. It is not for particular individuals, for the more or the less learned. It is for all people. And therefore, the tefillah, that which goes on in the Beth Knesset, has to be appropriate and fitting, and has to take into account all those who wish to come to the Beth Knesset. And Rambam continues and writes, V'lu hayasham ish echad, even if there's only one person in the tzibur, in the community, who is zaken, who is very old, or halash, or very weak, or nimol, literally someone who has just been recently circumcised. There is also an alternate translation that we're referring to someone who himself is a mohel, who has to go rush off and perform a milah, a circumcision. In other words, this person is in haste to mekayem a miswah, to do something that is required to do according to the Torah, and delaying the tefillah will hold him up from doing this. As a result of the sibur adding various additions to the tefillah which are not required, this person, whether he's old or sick or in a rush for whatever reason, is going to be held up, will be delayed, and may suffer as a result of this. One can well understand a situation, for example, where a frail and elderly person wishes to come to the Beth Knesset, very much so, in fact, because he's been doing this all his life, and he does not wish to stop now. But if truth be told, it is very difficult for him to sit through a tefillah that goes on for 5 or 6 hours, because of all the Piyutim and other additions that are added to the tefillah. Whereas if the optional additions were dropped, the tefillah could be perhaps half of that time, and maybe even less. So this could be true for a person who is ill or very old, or even if we're talking about a weekday, it could be a person who is in a rush to get to work because that is what he must do, and this is his livelihood. And every additional minute in the Beth Knesset is something that he cannot afford. So Rambam says a Beth Knesset has to run according to those who are in this position, not according to those who have all the leisure in the world. And therefore Rambam says, "Ubechol zan nikra b'shem sibur halash shebahem." When we speak of the sibur, we have to think of and have in mind the weak and the frail, the sick, or those who are pressed for time for various legitimate reasons. They are the sibur, and we have to fit in with them and not the other way around. And we have to, in every way, run the tefillah in the Beth Knesset in such a way as to make things easier for them and not the opposite. And therefore we are not to add to the time and the effort required for Avodat Hashem in the Beth Knesset. Of course, for those who wish to do more before or after, or just have their own minyan where they do things differently and take their time and add various elements to the tefillah, that of course is possible and perhaps even very commendable. But it is not correct to impose this on the entire Tzibur. This is the thrust of Rambam's words in this Teshuvah. And in another Teshuvah, Siman Resh Nun Daled on page 467, Rambam writes as follows with regards to Piyutim in general. He says, when it comes to Piyutim, he says, they asher hem tosefet inyanim v'hava'at devarim harbe. Piyutim are usually all manner of extra and extraneous statements and content she'inam me'inyan tefillah, which are not necessarily directly related to the tefillah at hand. That is to say, the essential nusach of the tefillah as instituted by Hazal. V'nosafim lezeh, and in addition to this, mishkalam v'nigunam, there is also the question of the rhyme and the tunes that are used frequently to sing or to repeat these piyutim as part of the tefillah. And Rambam says, and this is based on Rambam's observations, his understanding of the reality as he saw it. وَيَسَيْتْ هَتَّفِلَا مِغَذِرْ هَتَّفِلَا وَنَعْسَيْتْ لِسْحَوْكَ, or one could perhaps translate better, as I've seen elsewhere, l'sha'ashua. In other words, the tefillah, rather than being a tefillah, a prayer, a supplication, or a shevach as intended by the Chachamim, it becomes sometimes a kind of entertainment. And Rambam concludes, وَزَوْ هَسِّبَا هَيُثَرْ گَذُولَا, and this is the central reason, لَحِسْرَنْ هَكَوَنَا, for the lack of proper concentration and focus and attitude during tefillah in the Beit Knesset. وَشَهَهَمَون مَكِلِيم Rosh لِلصُّحَيَحْ بَأَمْسَعَ tefillah, and this is the main reason that many of the common people choose to speak or engage themselves in other activities during the tefillah whilst these piyutim are being recited, lefi shehem margishim, because they sense correctly, she'elu ha'devarim ha'ne'emarim enam mehuyavim, because they feel, they conclude, and they are not wrong, that these parts of the tefillah are actually not essential, and one can do without them. And frankly, most people do not have the patience, the concentration, the ability to focus for so long and stand in awe and be in the proper frame of mind for a tefillah that goes on and on with such piyutim. These were Rambam's observations and conclusions 850 years ago. And I believe any honest person who takes an objective look at what goes on in many Batei Knesset, I think it would be fair to say most shuls around the world, particularly Ashkenazi shuls, but not necessarily so, will be forced to reach precisely the same conclusion. And the Rambam adds one more observation, and he says as follows, وَنُصَافْ لَزَيْ, in addition to this, شَأَلُوا piyutim hem lif'amim divrei meshorerim. It is sometimes the case that these various piyutim were written by people whose main talent was in the field of poetry, writing beautiful liturgical poems, but not necessarily, he says, lo tamidei hachamim, not necessarily wise Torah scholars. Ad sheyu re'uyim lithanen b'divrehem u'litkarev bahem le'Elohim. It is therefore not obvious, says Rambam, that it is the correct and wise path always to invest one's time and energy in attempting to worship Hashem by repeating these words in these piyutim, rather than concentrating on things that are clearly of a much higher level, of much greater importance. As Rambam writes, وَشَيَسِيرُ مِنَ الدِّفَرِيمْ شَحِبَرُوا هَنَّبِيِّيمْ, and this takes us away, this distracts us, and obviously also detracts from the time that we have to study the words of the Nevi'im, or Misha b'madrigat Nevi'im, those on the same level as the Nevi'im, that is to say, Hazal. What Rambam is driving at is that it would be preferable in most, if not all cases, with regards to these piyutim, it would be preferable to stick to the essential tefillot as instituted by Hazal, and as part of the gathering of the people in the Beit Knesset on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, when people have more time during the week, this is not usually possible, to have a shiur based on a Mishnah, based on the words of one of the Nevi'im, taking a perek of Tehillim and explaining it to the tzibur. The words of Tehillim are certainly more important than the words, the ideas, the statements of any piyut written by anybody, no matter how great. And surely this would be of more importance and greater benefit to the public than concentrating so much time and effort on these piyutim. Those are Rambam's sentiments and thoughts on this matter. But Rambam was also referring to the practice of reciting piyutim before or after the tefillah, before or after Kriyat Shema. This too, he was not at all convinced was the correct choice for the tzibur, for the people who come to the Beit Knesset and have a limited amount of time and a limited attention span. Similar sentiments we find in the Tur, in Bar-Hayim Siman Samech Het. The Tur, of course, was written by Rabbeinu Yaakov Ba'al HaTurim, the son of the Rosh, who was an Ashkenazi who fled to Spain when he was still a young man, and he therefore also became acquainted with the Sfaradi order of tefillah in the Beit Knesset, which was quite different from that of the Ashkenazim, particularly with regards to piyutim. Here in Siman Samech Het, Hilchot Kriyat Shema, the Tur writes about the minhag of reciting krovetz, which means certain piyutim that were recited as part of the brachot before and after Kriyat Shema. And he quotes here a teshuvah from the Ramah, Resh Memhe, Rabbi Meir Halevi Abulafia, a great chacham in Sfarad in Spain before the time of the Tur. And he quotes him as follows. He says, Asur lafsik, it is asur to recite these piyutim as part of the brachot. And he goes on to say, Wa'asher hu gad lachem, and as for that which you have heard regarding my practice, Shani yoshev benehem, that I sit in the shul and with the tzibur, the community, reciting these piyutim, v'shomea v'shothek, and I do not recite it with them. I just listen, and I sit in silence and opt out of this practice. Emet hu gad lachem, this is true. And he makes it clear in his responsum here, the Ramah, that he was opposed to this practice, but also on the other hand he did not feel that he had the power to prevent the tzibur from behaving in this fashion. And the Tur also writes at the end of the Siman, even though he does mention other opinions that it is mutar to recite these piyutim, he says, Mikol makom tov uyafeh, it is nevertheless correct and proper. Yafeh davar levatla, it is better and more correct to put an end to this practice. Lemi she'efshar, if we're talking about a place and a time where the hacham will be listened to, if the tzibur will take note of what the hacham says, what the rav of the town, of the shul states, if he has the power, he should put an end to this practice. Ki hi siba lahafsik b'siha b'tela, because this in practice leads to the common people speaking and chatting amongst themselves during tefillah b'divrei havai, talking about all kinds of irrelevant and nonsensical things, when they should of course be in a very different state of mind and conducting themselves very differently during the tefillah. All of these discussions, of course, took place many, many centuries ago. Nothing to do with Corona, of course. At the present time, due to the various restrictions, many people are very concerned that the tefillah on Rosh HaShannah or Yom Kippur will not be the same as they have become used to over the years. And this is almost certainly the case. This is how things will be. What I'm suggesting here is that this is perhaps much less a reason for concern than many people feel. It is perhaps an opportunity to experience tefillah in its original form without these piyutim, which have, without a doubt, as we read explicitly in the words of Rambam and the Tur and the Ramah, which have clearly a downside to them, perhaps even are against the halakha, but certainly, even if they are not so, in practice they lead to unfortunate and disturbing outcomes. This is perhaps a God-sent opportunity to reacquaint ourselves with the basic fundamental format of tefillah as instituted and as conceived by Hazal, and who were the Talmidim of the Nevi'im, to experience tefillah without these piyutim, without all these additions, which will result in a much more concise tefillah, but also, very possibly, will result in a tefillah which people will find that they are able to focus on, concentrate on, and not feel that it is oppressively long and confusing and monotonous. And it is possible, I think, that at least some people or some communities will, having experienced a different kind of tefillah, will wish to make this a permanent feature of their Avodat Hashem.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.